Good morning, Internet. We're now on to Chapter 3, Pride and Prejudice, Everyman Library. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject, was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. Basically, she's nosy as hell and she doesn't know what to ask. They attacked him in various ways with barefaced questions, ingenious superstitions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skills of them all, and they were at least obligated to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favorable. Sir William has been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Okay, this is where Darcy comes with the Mr. Bingley, so we all know how that works. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, one of Austen's more famous quotes, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart was entertained. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." As we discussed in chapter 1 or 2, the importance of why Mrs. Bennet is really looking to get her daughters wed, and primarily it is so that they're taken care of. As there's no heir to the Bennet estate, it's going to fall into Mr. Collins, and he could keep Mrs. Bennet and the girls at his whim, or they'd be forced to go somewhere else. In a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to the sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, but he only saw the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from the upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that would do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honor of their invitation, and Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he would have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and he began to fear that he might always be flying from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears for a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to get a larger party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but they were comforted that day before the ball by hearing that instead of 12 he had brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. We always know about Caroline Bingley, but I guess I totally spaced out that Bingley had 4 other sisters. But we do know I believe in the 1995 version, Caroline is with their cousin, or maybe it's another sister, at the assembly. Somebody correct me. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked at the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine tall person, handsome features, noble mind, and the reports which were in general circulation within 5 minutes of his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. And as the history lesson went, an episode or 2 back, 100,000 pounds a year is equated to about, or 10,000 a year is equated to about 100,000 to 150,000 pounds in today's money. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much more handsome than Mr. Bingley, and he even looked with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire would have saved him from being the most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, and was angry that the ball had closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend! Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by him having slighted one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged, by the scarcity of gentlemen, to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of the time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to overheard a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join in. "Come, Darcy," said he, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it unless I'm particularly acquainted with my partner. As such, an assembly at this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in this room whom it would be a punishment to me to stand up with." "I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honor, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them you see are uncommonly pretty." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," Mr. Darcy said, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Ooh, Darcy's a dick. "You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings towards him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition which delighted in anything ridiculous. The whole evening together passed off pleasantly, as to the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice. Well, in Regency era, this is pretty much as close as to foreplay you're going to get. And she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was the most gratified by this, as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasures. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough to never be without partners, which is all that they had yet learnt to care for at a ball. They returned therefore in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were principal inhabitants. They found Mr. Bennet still up. With a book he was regardless of time, and on the present occasion he had a good deal of curiosity as to the event of an evening which had raised such splendid expectations. He had rather hoped that all his wife's views on the stranger would be disappointed, but he soon found that he had a very different story to hear. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," as she entered the room, "we have had the most delightful evening, a most excellent ball. I wish you had been there. Jane was so admired, nothing could be like it. Everybody said how well she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought her quite beautiful and danced with her twice. And she was the only creature in the room that he asked for a second time. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas. I was so vexed to see him stand up with her, but, however, he did not admire her at all. Indeed, nobody can, and he seemed quite struck with Jane as she was going down the dance. So he inquired who she was, and got introduced, and asked her for the next 2. Then the 2/3 he danced with Miss King, and the 2/4 were with Maria Lucas, and the 2/5 with Jane again, and the 2/6 with Lizzy, and the Bullinger. If he had any compassion for me, cried her husband impatiently, he would not have danced half so much. For God's sake, says no more of his partners. Oh, and that he had sprained his ankle in the first dance. Oh, my dear, continued Mrs. Bennet, I'm quite delighted with him. He is so exceedingly handsome, and his sisters were charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegantly than their dresses. I dare say the lace upon Mrs. Hurst's gown. And here she was interrupted again. Mr. Bennet protested against any description of finery. She was therefore obliged to seek another branch of the subject, and related with much bitterness of spirit, and some exaggeration, the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. But I can assure you, she added, that Lizzy does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he is the most disagreeable, horrid man, not all the worth pleasing. So high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself very great, not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to have given him one of your set-downs. I quite detest the man. So interestingly, we are learning that Mrs. Bennet has her opinion about Mr. Darcy, and it's been quite a while since I've seen the 1995 version, but I don't quite recall her dressing down Mr. Darcy with Mr. Bennet in 2005. But I do understand in both versions that you can only do so much with what you have in such a short amount of time. Granted, the 1995 BBC version is, what, 5 or 6 hours long. I know it's like 5 or 6 episodes. I forget which. And the movie is 2.5 hours. If anybody has seen any of the previous incarnations of Pride and Prejudice, and if you want to tell me about what those were like and how close they were to the actual book as far as we have seen, that would be great. So please leave a comment. And until now, see you at chapter 4.